Good day. Today is Monday, 7th April 2025, and of course we continue to get more turmoil in the international financial markets, steep declines in international stock markets, falls in the price of oil, significant falls in the price of oil, turbulence in international currency markets, all in reaction to Donald Trump's announcements last week of his various tariffs, which he has imposed on most of the countries in the world. And various countries are responding to these tariffs to the extent that they can. Vietnam, Taiwan are trying to negotiate with the United States. There doesn't seem to be much sign for the moment that the United States is interested in giving much ground, or at least the Trump administration is prepared to give much ground on the tariffs. And the president himself and his advisors, his immediate circle of advisors, they remain, so far as I can see, committed to the course that they have followed. In the president's case, where there's been a long article about the decision-making process which led to the tariff announcement, and it was one thing immediately stood out for me about this process, which is that the president's team offered him a menu of different options that he could pick, and he chose to go with the toughest one, with the result that the United States now has, I believe, just about the toughest tariffs, the strongest tariff policy, the strongest protectionist policy that it has had in its history. Something that perhaps was not anticipated even by some of the president's closest advisors. But the fact that the president, Donald Trump, went that far shows, to my mind, how deeply committed he is to this strategy. And despite the pressures in the financial markets, despite the cries of opposition that one finds in various quarters, despite the fact that many governments express deep unhappiness and even anger about what has happened, I get no sense that Donald Trump is prepared to change course. It would take an economic cataclysm to make him do so, and even then I think he would be very reluctant to change course, if only because if he did change course now, if he did start to bargain away the tariffs, not only would he, as he believes, compromise on his project for the economic regeneration of the United States and break faith with his core supporters, but I think he also recognizes that if he were to take that enormous step of pulling back from what he has done, well, it would be the end of him politically. His ability to take decisions to govern the United States would be compromised. His political opponents, who still have probably a majority in Congress, but who up to now have been consistently placed on the defensive, would recover their morale and would hit back and move against him. And I think Trump realizes that, for better or for worse, his presidency, his reputation, now rests and falls with the tariffs. So for that reason, I don't think he's going to shift from the policy, a policy which, incidentally, I should make clear again, I believe that he completely believes in. Now, I should say that, as I said, various countries around the world have taken steps to respond to these tariffs. There is, however, or continues to be, extraordinary chaos, muddle in terms of how the European Union, the European states, are going to respond. Now, there's recently been an article in The Economist. They've just been to China. Economist, a very, very pro-American magazine generally, strongly neocon in its foreign policy orientations, bitterly anti-communist and anti-Soviet during the period of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, then bitterly hostile, perhaps even more hostile if possible, to President Putin and his government, since President Putin became president of Russia in the early 2000s. Anyway, The Economist, which is generally not been at all friendly towards China in recent years. Anyway, they went to China recently. They sent a team of people to China. They found the Chinese full of confidence, confident that they would be able to surmount the challenge of the Trump tariffs, making clear that they had anticipated these Trump tariffs, that under Xi Jinping's leadership, China has been preparing carefully for the economic war which the Chinese judge the United States is now waging against them, and altogether confident that they can come through. And apparently there have been all kinds of preparations. We've heard lots of reports about how China has stockpiled raw materials. We all know how China has worked hard to create the BRICS and the trade and financing and payment systems that go alongside the BRICS, are part of the BRICS. The Chinese have also developed their own economic and technological strategies. They've pursued technological sovereignty from the United States for quite a long time, which is one of the reasons, by the way, why they have been able to make such progress in AI technology and in chips production to an extent that surprised the Americans, even after the Biden administration started to impose restrictions on high technology transfers to China. Well, China apparently did prepare for all of this, and they took Trump's various comments about tariffs, comments that he made throughout the election, his invocations of President McKinley, the 19th century president, who Trump sees as the major figure in implementing tariff policies. They noticed Trump's various comments about tariffs, about protection. They took all of this very seriously, and they have worked hard, and they planned, and they prepared for this. What have the Europeans, the United States, other biggest trading partner, done? Well, I think the answer is absolutely nothing. They saw the election. They heard what Trump had to say during the election. They persuaded themselves that he was not going to win the election. When Joe Biden stepped down, they were convinced that the election would be won by Kamala Harris. Keir Starmer, of course, sent a team of people to help Kamala Harris win the election, confident that she was going to win it anyway, and that she would repay this action by further displays of gratitude towards Keir Starmer and towards Britain. And to the surprise and dismay of the Europeans, Donald Trump nonetheless went ahead and won the election and became president of the United States. And still, despite the fact that Trump became president and still said that he intended to impose tariffs, they still told themselves that either this wasn't going to happen, or that it wasn't important, or they chose to talk about other things instead. They weren't going to focus so much on the tariffs. They didn't really carry out any plans. I've not seen a single shred of evidence that the European Union, that the European Commission, that the agencies of the British, French or German government have given any thought at all, let alone undertaken any concrete plans to address the potential challenge of Trump's endlessly threatened and constantly repeated resort to tariffs. Instead, they've talked incessantly and continuously about something entirely different. What is it that they have been talking about? Well, it's not difficult. They've been talking about Ukraine, about the threat from the East, about Russia. Ever since Donald Trump became president, they've been less worried about the tariffs. In fact, they haven't been worried about the tariffs at all. They haven't thought about the tariffs. They haven't thought about how they would respond to the tariffs, the effect the tariffs might have on the European economies. They've been sort of worried about the fact that the United States seems to be reversing course on Project Ukraine, that it's been dropping hints that it feels that Project Ukraine has gone as far as it can go, and that the United States, that Donald Trump wants some kind of peace in Ukraine and a rapprochement with the Russians. Of course, all of this has been deeply unpopular with the Europeans. But I would argue it's hardly an existential issue for them. Certainly, it is not an existential issue for most citizens of the EU and of Britain. What happens in Ukraine? Well, it's not immediately pressing problem in the way that the end of the globalist system of economics that we have lived under for the last 30 years would be. But anyway, despite that, despite the fact that this massive express train, the Trump tariffs, was hurtling in their direction, what did the Europeans do? Well, they convened one meeting after another. Emmanuel Macron convened several meetings. Keir Starmer convened several meetings in Paris, meetings in London. At times it looked as if Macron and Starmer were working together. At other times it seemed as if they were competing with each other. Anyway, all of these meetings took place, and they all ended in agreements to hold other meetings, and they all discussed one topic, which is, of course, Ukraine, and about what to do about the moves that Donald Trump was making to achieve either a ceasefire in Ukraine or a peace settlement in Ukraine or some kind of rapprochement in Ukraine. And very quickly, very rapidly, it all became a discussion about deploying European peacekeeping forces to Ukraine. And there was talk about setting up a coalition of the willing, and that French troops would be sent to Ukraine and British troops would be sent to Ukraine. The French and British armies not keen on that idea at all, but Macron and Starmer absolutely committed to doing it. The French taking a harder line than the British at times. Starmer going to Kiev, signing a treaty there, 100-year treaty with Ukraine, in which spoke about Ukraine's irreversible course towards NATO. The Europeans agreeing with each other that sanctions against Russia must be maintained, irrespective of whatever it was that Donald Trump and his officials might be doing on the tariff question. This is by far the more important issue for the Europeans. So they were talking all about this with each other. They couldn't agree. Some European countries not keen on this idea at all. Poland saying that they didn't want to be involved. Italy saying that they too didn't want to be involved. Hungary and Slovakia refusing to involve themselves in any way in this absurd enterprise. But hours, days, weeks of time devoted to this issue of whether or not to send troops to Ukraine, or if not troops to Ukraine, to establish no-fly zones over Ukraine, to do all of the various things that needed to be done to make progress towards peace in Ukraine, towards rapprochement between Russia and the United States, more difficult than it might otherwise be. And of course, rolling the red carpet all the time for their favourite hero, President Zelensky. He turns up at every one of these meetings. Ian Proud, former British diplomat, a wonderful commentator on international affairs. He's written about this brilliantly. Wrote a brilliant piece about this. Zelensky invited to every single one of these meetings. He's the hero of the hour. People want to be photographed with him. Keir Starmer hugs him outside Downing Street. Everybody hangs on every inconsistent, incoherent, rambling, far-fetched, unoriginal word that Zelensky blurts out during these meetings. Anyway, again, hours of time, days of time devoted to holding meetings about this, about Ukraine, about peacekeeping forces, about ceasefires which have not been negotiated, about whether the Russians should agree to unconditional ceasefires or not, whether Ukraine should be pressured to do this or that. All of this has been the issue, the topic that European leaders have given overwhelming, overriding priority to. But planning for possible Trump tariffs, doing the things that the Chinese have been doing, and by the way, which the Russians also were doing. The Russians used the time actually going all the way back to the 2008 financial crisis to take steps to proof their economy from turbulence in Western financial markets. And that worked after 2014. That led smoothly after 2014 into further work to proof their economy against sanctions, to prepare for sanctions and for all of those things. And of course, all of that has borne fruit, just as I'm sure that all the planning and preparation the Chinese have been doing will bear fruit also. Well, the Europeans, as we see, have done none of that. They did none of that last year when, as I said, Trump was the possibility that Trump might be elected president of the United States began to loom on the horizon. They did absolutely nothing about it after he was elected president of the United States, still talking about tariffs. They did nothing about it after Trump became president of the United States. And then, of course, the tariffs came. And they were left completely, entirely, totally, disastrously unprepared. And now they're scrambling and they're talking about retaliations and imposing retaliatory tariffs against the United States, except that some countries within the EU question the point of that and wonder why the EU should be moving towards escalation of the trade war. Similar discussion is taking place in Britain at the moment. The crisis deepens across Europe, and nobody has prepared or done anything in advance or seems to have any answers. Now, yesterday I talked about Britain. You could say the same about other countries in Europe. So France, President Macron, he's very angry now with President Trump. At one time, long time ago, I think it was as long ago as 2 or 3 weeks ago, Macron was telling everybody what a good friend he and Donald Trump were. He went to the United States. Starmer followed a couple of days later, and Zelensky followed a couple of days after that. And Macron was convinced that he had this enormous relationship with Trump. He'd met Trump in Paris before Trump was inaugurated. He'd taken him to Notre Dame. When he went to the United States, he spent hours of time laughing at Trump's jokes, flattering Trump in every possible way that he could, trying to maneuver Trump into granting the Europeans, giving the Europeans security guarantees for any European troops that were deployed to Ukraine, something, of course, which never happened. Well, in those days, Macron was telling everybody that he and Donald Trump were best friends, that he at least knew how to talk to Trump and how to work with him, and had gained Trump's confidence and trust. Now, this same Macron, formerly Donald Trump's best friend, is talking about disinvesting from the United States, getting all European Union companies and businesses to stop investing in the United States. He obviously wants French companies to do the same. He talks about the need for Europe to separate itself economically from the United States, to pursue its own destiny. He's even talking to some extent about the need for some kind of long-term rapprochement with Russia. Though, of course, he's not prepared to make any concessions to the Russians of any sort at all in order to achieve that. But anyway, that's Macron about forging together a plan, convening a European Council meeting, getting teams of experts together to look at what can be done, to work out how individual European industries and businesses will be affected, discussing sectoral approaches to this problem. Well, again, Macron shows little understanding of the need for doing any of these things. And Ursula von der Leyen and the European Union, well, they're showing little understanding of what to do either. Creating funds is what they do. They seem to be keen to create still more funds to try to counter the tariffs. They want funds for rearmament. They want funds for presumably supporting European industries. How all of this correlates with the Draghi plan, which wanted 800 billion euros of investment a year in European high technology industries, coordinated by the EU Centre. Anyway, how all of that correlates with this latest emergency and the need to set up more funds, it's completely unclear to me. But again, of course, Ursula von der Leyen still has lots of things to say about Ukraine and about the need to stand by Ukraine. But what about the soon-to-be leader of the EU's most powerful economy, Friedrich Merz, the man who just won the German election? He's not Chancellor yet. He's involved in intricate and incredibly complicated negotiations with the SPD to try to create a grand coalition. Now, negotiations of this kind are common enough in Germany. Before a coalition is formed, there is usually an agreement, a kind of contract between the two parties. These contracts can be incredibly detailed. This looks like it's going to be no different. The SPD has been holding out for all kinds of things. The Financial Times describes it this way. Merz has been embroiled in difficult negotiations with the SPD over social benefits, tax cuts and migration. Merz's only possible coalition partner needs its members to approve the coalition deal before electing Merz as Chancellor, probably in early May, according to party insiders. So this is a complex negotiation. And then, as is always the way with the SPD, they have to put the coalition agreement to the vote of the SPD membership. And I'm going to say, I think it is far from a foregone conclusion that the SPD membership will approve it. The SPD has, in one form or another, been in continuous government for almost a decade now, as coalition partners to Angela Merkel, as the leaders of the coalition under Scholz, and now they're being asked to go into coalition with Merz all over again. And as a result of that process, the party has become tired and withered, and its identity has gradually eroded away, and it sees the combined left parties, Die Linke and the BSW, now almost close to equaling its vote share. And I would have thought that what the SPD really needs in order to rediscover itself and re-establish contacts with its grassroots is to go into opposition. Of course, there are always people within the leadership of the SPD very accustomed to power, very accustomed to ministerial positions and all of the trappings that go with that. They will resist that argument as strongly as they can, and there will probably be a battle within the SPD before the coalition agreement with Merz is approved. All right, this isn't perhaps Merz's doing. What alternative coalition partner does he have? He wouldn't, I think, in fact, he definitely wouldn't have a majority if he entered into a coalition with the Greens, and members of the CDU hate the Greens anyway and would probably react extremely negatively if Merz even entertained the idea of a coalition with the Greens. And Merz, of course, has categorically ruled out a coalition deal with the AfD. So Merz, at the moment, is not Chancellor. Doesn't look as if he's going to be Chancellor before May. Scholz carries on as Chancellor, transitional Chancellor, in the meantime, leading a broken government which nobody takes seriously. Annalena Baerbock remains, by the way, Germany's foreign minister. Boris Pistorius remains Germany's defense minister. And in the meantime, even as this protracted process continues, Germany faces now the added headwinds of the Trump tariffs. And without a government, without a strong leader, or a leader who projects a sense of vision and direction on how to address these problems, Germany is drifting, even as its economy continues to descend downwards. Now, there has been an article about this in the Financial Times, and the title of the article is "US Tariffs Create Urgent Problem for Germany," says Friedrich Merz. That's the title of the article. The title doesn't do justice to the dismal picture that the article actually provides. I'm going to read extracts from it. Germany's Chancellor-in-Waiting, Friedrich Merz, has warned of the dramatic impact of US tariffs on global markets and on Germany in his first comments since US President Trump unveiled sweeping levies against the EU. The situation on the international equity and bond markets is dramatic and threatens to deteriorate further. That is a startling piece of insight from Friedrich Merz. He has noticed that stock markets and financial markets across the world are tumbling. He's just told us this. None of us had noticed. But anyway, we must at least be grateful for the fact that Merz has noticed that there is chaos in the financial markets. And then he goes on to say this: it is therefore more urgent than ever for Germany to restore its international competitiveness as quickly as possible. Right, how does one do that? Well, we are told how important exports for Germany, exports to the United States are for Germany. The Financial Times says the Eurozone's largest economy relies on exports to the United States for about 4% of its GDP, more than France or Italy. The German economy has been stagnating for 3 years as it has been hit by higher energy costs. Notice the casual way in which that is said in passing. As it has been hit by higher energy costs. No mention of why that has come about. The decision to cut off Germany from Russian gas and oil and all of that kind of thing. So the economy has been stagnating for 3 years as it's been hit by higher energy costs, those, of course, being an act of God, just to say. Not the work of Olaf Scholz and his coalition, cheered on by Friedrich Merz, who said that the anti-Russian actions didn't go far enough. And also, by the way, just to go back to the Financial Times article, lower demand for German goods in China and fierce competition from Chinese rivals. That, of course, the competition from Chinese rivals is now going to intensify because the Chinese inevitably, as they find it difficult or more difficult to access the American market, are going to compete more aggressively with the Germans on other markets for manufactured goods. And then we go on to read, according to an estimate by the Cologne Institute for Economic Research, the total economic harm to the German economy over Trump's 4-year term could add up to 200 billion euros, leading to a GDP level that is 1.5 percentage points lower in 2028. The US accounts for 1 in 10 of German exports. Over the short term, the incoming government will struggle to cushion the immediate trade shock, Deutsche Bank economists wrote in a note on Monday, adding that Germany may even face a 3rd year of declining GDP in 2025. If implemented in full, US tariffs would massively damage the German economy and could lead it to contract this year. The new Munich-based IFO Institute for Economic Research said last week. Some key industries such as automotive and mechanical engineering would be particularly hard hit, it said. As Germany's economy is already stagnating, it is possible that the Trump tariffs will push economic growth in Germany below zero, said IFO President Clemens Feust. Well, there you go. So, again, Germany has done absolutely nothing to prepare for the Trump tariffs. It's been focused on supporting Ukraine. It's been giving vast amounts of money to Ukraine. It's been stripping the Bundeswehr of its weapons to support Ukraine. It has also cut itself off from cheap, reliable supplies of Russian energy, making the German economy uncompetitive. Friedrich Merz says that it is urgent, more urgent than ever, for Germany to restore its international competitiveness as quickly as possible. Well, here's a suggestion then. Why not reopen the Nord Stream pipeline, the one pipe which could be brought back into operation? Why not go to Moscow and see whether you can sort something out with the Russians, at least on the energy front? That would probably not solve the whole problem, but it would at least improve Germany's international competitiveness as quickly as possible. It can be done. But no, of course, Friedrich Merz, despite the fact that the minister-presidents of two German states, Saxony and Thuringia, are calling for it, well, he has completely set his face against doing this thing. Now, in previous programs, I have discussed Merz's decision to lift the debt brake and to start a major program of funding for rearmament and for rebuilding, supposedly, Germany's infrastructure. I've said that, in my opinion, all that is going to do is going to lead to a huge increase in debt in Germany, undermining Germany's reputation as a steady, solvent country. I predicted that in a couple of years' time, debt levels in Germany, debt to GDP ratio will, in Germany as elsewhere in Europe, and also, by the way, the United States, will be above 100%. I've also said that all of this funding is not going to achieve the great rearmament that some people in Germany, including presumably Merz himself, believe. There's been some very interesting articles and discussions about problems for European rearmament. There was a long article in the Daily Telegraph, for example, which says that there's something nobody wants to tell you about dependence on the US defense industry. It was published on the 27th of March, and it's by Lewis Page. It makes the point that there's barely any weapon system produced in Europe that does not rely on American-produced components, and that this, in fact, gives the United States enormous authority over the development of and deployment of European weapons, and that given the extent to which Europe relies on fundamental technologies in weapons production on the United States, replacing all these many, many different types of technologies would be a work of decades. And I mentioned in previous programs the actually very short article that was published by the Royal United Services Institute about the critical state of the European economies. The title, by the way, of that article is Winning the Industrial War, Comparing Russia, Europe and Ukraine 2022-2024. The article speaks about how Russia has had a well-developed plan for military-industrial mobilization, which it implemented early in the war. It has highly centralized level of coordination over the respective defense industries, and has an understanding of the supply chains to enable a coherent orchestration of investments. By contrast, Europe lacks control, can only incentivize industry, whilst governments and industry lack an understanding of their own supply chains, leading to massive internal competition and uneven expansion. And it goes on to say, that in Europe, the burden of regulation is self-defeating in raising the cost and slowing the production of equipment. Incentives for stockpiling equipment and taking risk are skewed in such a way as to lead to systemic policy failure. Regulatory reform and harmonization for testing, procurement, storage and transportation of defense material is essential. And it then straightforwardly concedes that simply throwing money at a problem, in other words, the problem of military procurement in Europe, is not going to solve anything. The fragmentation of the European defence market has meant that money is spent very inefficiently, and there is no conceivable way, frankly, that is going to change. So I am going to repeat again that was from Royal United Services Institute. Merz's great programme of spending vast sums of money on defence is not going to achieve the great defence build-up that some people want and many fear. It is certainly not going to lead to Germany's reindustrialization or the reversal of Germany's industrial processes. What it is going to do instead is that as Germany tries to divert more and more of its increasingly limited industrial capacity towards arms production, that limited capacity will be taken out of the civilian goods production system, obliging Germany to rely more on imports, leading firstly to higher inflation in the United States and ultimately to accelerated deindustrialization. And now, in the world of tariffs, that's going to happen even more, because German industry, without cheap Russian gas, even to some extent with cheap Russian gas, is going to be uncompetitive. It's going to lose one of its major customers, which is the United States, or it's going to see reductions in its ability to export to one of its major customers, the United States. It's going to struggle to export to China because China's economy has developed beyond the level where it needs to import goods from Germany. So in that situation, where the Germans are in effect themselves starting to reduce production of consumer goods, cars, household appliances, those sort of things, as factories are either closed down or attempts are made to divert them to military production. Well, where are they going to get their consumer goods from, the Germans? They're going to get them from abroad. First and foremost, I suspect, ultimately, whatever tariffs the EU imposes from China. And again, this plan, the Merz plan, which is all about increasing spending on infrastructure, and by the way, infrastructure spending is going to have exactly the same effect. Inevitably, it means more imports in order to be able to carry out that upgrading of infrastructure. Germany doesn't produce enough. It doesn't have a big enough industrial base by itself, especially now that that industrial base is contracting and parts of it are going to be diverted to making weapons, or trying to make weapons, in order to provide the equipment and the technical supplies to build up that infrastructure. And of course, Germany isn't just going to have to, not only going to have to import equipment in order to upgrade the infrastructure, it's going to have to import raw materials as well. So, by the way, will the defense industries. Defense industries are exceptionally heavy users of energy and raw materials. It costs an awful lot in energy terms to build a tank. It costs an awful lot in energy terms to build armored vehicles in large quantities. You need huge amounts of steel, all kinds of precious, all kinds of alloys, metals for alloys, tungsten, whatever. Germany doesn't produce these things. It is not a resource-rich country in that kind of way. So it's going to have to import them also. So one way or another, we're going to see very quickly Germany move from being a net exporter, a big net exporter, with a large current account, to becoming a deficit country. Now, is Merz, in light of what's happened, rethinking any of this? Is he considering that with the Trump tariffs, he may very well have an economic recession to deal with? Well, I don't know. He's not giving any sign of doing so. I am going to make a prediction, anyway, that over the next year or so, as the pressures from the tariffs increase, and perhaps as energy supplies dwindle at the end of the year, with possibly a lack of gas in the reserves, though maybe if gas energy prices continue to fall, it will be possible to buy gas to fill up the reserves at lower prices in the summer. This is not impossible, and we'll just have to wait and see. But my guess is that if Germany falls into recession, as I think is quite likely, in fact, as I think is much more probable than not, much of the money that Merz has assigned to arms production and to infrastructure spending is actually going to have to be used. Indeed, is going to be eaten up trying to provide some support to the German domestic economy. Germany, for example, still operates an extremely elaborate welfare system. Of course, Merz could try to cut that away, but then his SPD coalition partners might balk at that. Just saying. So, more likely than not, the way to square the circle come the end of the year, as recession pressures intensify, will be to spend some of this money, the 500 billion euros allocated for infrastructure, money that would supposedly otherwise have gone to arms, to supporting businesses and companies in Germany, to trying to keep the welfare bills paid, to doing all of the things that Germany and other European states conventionally do during times of recession. Was there any preparation for this? Was any forethought given to this? Did Merz plan for this when he did away with the debt brake? Did he try and consult with Trump to find out how serious Trump really was about the tariffs before making the decisions that he did, doing away with the debt brake and all of that? Well, of course not. So we see Britain, France, Germany, the European Union, they are all at sea. They haven't a clue what to do. They are a ship on a storm-tossed sea. Nobody amongst them can agree who the pilot should be, who should pilot the ship through the storm. In fact, they're all arguing with each other about it, and they can't decide in which direction to trim the sails. It is a dismal picture, and one which is going to continue to play out over the next couple of years until, well, I don't quite know what. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say this morning, or today rather I should say, about the overall situation in the world as the Trump tariffs strike home. Now, let's turn back to that perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And I said yesterday that I've increasingly gained the impression that this much talked about big Russian offensive is actually already underway. The Russians didn't announce their offensive before it began, but then they never do. They never share their plans with anyone. The Ukrainians have talked about an offensive in late April or May, or perhaps in the summer. I thought that it might begin in May. But we now see significant movement on the front lines. Things have continued significantly since the start of the current advance about a week ago. And my own overall sense is that the momentum is accelerating. It is accelerating from one day to the next, in fact. We see not just more rapid Russian movements, but more signs that the Russians are working towards creating an operational crisis for Ukraine on multiple parts of the front line. Now, to illustrate the point I'm going to make about the speed of the Russian advance, there's been actually a very interesting and very good article today published by Simplicius the Thinker on his Substack blog, in which he gives an update over military developments. I'm not going to touch on that in any detail. I'm not going to quote from it. But you will find in this blog piece, two very interesting graphs. One shows the average daily change per month in square kilometers achieved by the Russians over the course of 2024, 2025, the period 2024, early 2025, the pace of the Russian advance, and also a comparison with the pace of that advance month by month with what happened in the first part of this year, January, February, March 2025, and what happened in 2024, the analogous period in 2024. And looking back to the first of these graphs, the one that actually just gives us a sense of the percentage increase in territory that the Russians are capturing, the percentage growth, we see that the Russian offensive did begin, indeed, in October 2023, when the Russians launched their attack on Avdiivka. Then there was very bitter fighting, mostly for Avdiivka, in October, November, December 2023, and January 2023. And then January 2024. And then in February 2024, Avdiivka fell. And you see a big sudden increase in territory that the Russians are capturing. And then it falls back significantly in March and April during the Rasputitsa period, the mud period. Then in May, there is a sharp increase. The Russians start advancing much, much more rapidly. In May, then there's a fallback in June, and July. And then in August, there is a further surge, and that surge continues through August, September, October, November, which was the fastest month of the Russian advance last year, with the tempo continuing to remain very fast in December and January, though starting to decline. And then in February and March, you see a certain stabilization. But interestingly enough, even though the Russian advance in February and March was slower than it had been in the preceding months, February and March of this year was slower than it had been in the preceding months, in the high summer and early autumn, it nonetheless was significantly higher, and this is also confirmed by the second graph, significantly higher than it was in the analogous months in February and March 2024. So we see here the effects of the Rasputitsa, of the spring thaw. There is normally a slowdown in the Russian advance in these periods of the year. When the weather turns hotter and drier in May last year there was a surge. I remember that there was a similar surge, by the way, in 2022 when the Russians were also advancing. And by the way, in 2023, it was in May 2023 that Bakhmut fell. And there's every reason to think that there will be a further similar surge in May this year as well. Except that this year, the base level is much higher than it was in 2024, because the tempo of operations in February and March of this year has been much greater than it was in February and March 2024. So that gives us a sense of how things are likely to move from this point on. The Russian offensive that ended basically in January began in October. It began slowly and gradually picked up momentum until it surged during the hot August, September weeks and in the early autumn. The offensive this time is also beginning relatively slowly, but much, much faster than the previous offensive did. And it is likely also to surge, and surge dramatically in the weeks in the summer and early autumn. So we could be looking at very rapid Russian advances indeed in May, June, July, August, continuing to accelerate in September, October, November, right until the coming of the winter, the frosts in the autumn. Well, it's possible. I don't see why this year should be any different. My sense is that the Russians are much stronger this year than they were last, and my further sense is that the Ukrainians are much weaker this year than they were last year. Now, moving forward, looking at this again, what exactly is going on at the moment on the various battlefronts? Well, the Russians, as Big Serge pointed out, in that big article on his Substack blog that I discussed several programs ago, by the end of last year's offensive, had positioned themselves in various very strong positions which provided strong launch points for a future offensive. And what we now see is that they're starting to move in precisely those places which Big Serge identified as being the sort of places where one would expect the Russians to move to take advantage of the positioning that they achieved last year and in the first weeks of this year. So firstly, they now have a very big bridgehead across the Oskol River. And we've been hearing a lot of reports, including more reports today, not just that the village of Kamienka, northwest of the Oskol River, is about to fall, but that the Russians are busy capturing increasing amount of territory west of the Oskol River, that they're very close to Kupiansk itself, that there are no significant Ukrainian formations or fortifications north of Kamienka itself, so that if the Russians were to advance beyond Kamienka towards the north, towards Volchansk, the only thing that would basically stop them is the limits of their own supply lines. Just saying. So here, possibly, in Kharkiv region, there is a possibility, a strong possibility now, of very significant Russian advances. The Russians further north, as far as I can see, have almost entirely cleared Volchansk, north of the Volcha River. There are perhaps one or two isolated footholds that the Ukrainians still control in northern Volchansk, but the high-rise buildings, the famous factory district that was fought for so long, those are now fully under Russian control. The Volchansk, south of the Volcha River, is basically a small is basically a collection of outlying suburbs. It does not look terribly defensible to me. The Russians also are apparently starting, or at least considering, advances from Lipsy, which is this village that they have been fighting over north of Kharkiv. There's a report from the Russians today that Ukrainian troops in Lipsy are very young and poorly trained and are not able to offer much resistance. And further north still, it looks as if Guyevo, the village that the Ukrainians have been fighting for and were perhaps surrounded in Kursk region, is now definitely about to fall. Many expect that it will fall by evening today, and that the Russians are now very close indeed to the next village near the border, the last important village by the border, which the village of Olyeshnya. Apparently, there's some suggestions that it's not really a village at all, but is basically a large farmstead. It's a sort of big farming complex. I'm not sure. There's apparently also a monastery in the area that the Ukrainians have also, in Kursk region, which they're still occupying and which they have fortified. But these are just a few places that the Ukrainians are clinging on to, and it's likely that they will be pushed out of them very soon now. The Russians have captured Basovka. I discussed this in previous programs. This has now been effectively confirmed. And the key village of Yanovka, apparently the Russians have almost reached and look likely to storm. Now, if they capture this particular village, Yanovka, then Sumy, the regional capital itself, a city of around 280,000 people before the war, suddenly becomes very vulnerable. And with the scale of the Ukrainian defeat in this area, one wonders what reserves and forces the Ukrainians have in order to hold on to Sumy. Bear in mind, it's probably a misunderstanding to think that because a city is beyond a certain size, it is more difficult to capture. A very big city is probably more difficult to defend by a relatively small force than a smaller city would be. Just saying. If a city is very large, then the attacker may be able to occupy significant parts of it without encountering much in the way of resistance, and that could undermine the whole defense of the city in its entirety. Mariupol, a city twice the size of Sumy, being a case in point. It took the Russians, as I remember, around 6 to 8 weeks to capture Mariupol, and this despite very intense resistance by highly motivated Ukrainian troops from the Azov Brigade and one of the Marine brigades that were stationed there. So anyway, let's move on. That's the situation in the north. Kupiansk itself, the Russians are now not only very close to Kupiansk, but they're capturing more and more territory close to Kupiansk itself. They are said to be building up forces very close to Liman on both sides of the Zherebets River. And there are reports that Russian troops have today consolidated control in the northern part of the small town of Torske. Now, if it is captured by the Russians, that is an operational crisis for the Ukrainian garrison in Siversk, because the capture of Torske threatens the supplies of the Ukrainian troops to Torske, in Siversk from the rear. Siversk is already, in effect, surrounded on 3 sides by Russian-controlled territory. And also the capture of Torske and Yampol apparently also opens up the way for a Russian attack on Liman, and there are various Russian forces already located, apparently increasingly close to Liman, west of the Zherebets River. Now, the fall of Liman not only brings the Russians very close to Slavyansk, but it perhaps also opens the way for a renewed Russian offensive to recapture Izium, especially if Kupiansk falls. So we can see that the ground is being prepared to do all of these things in this northern area. Now, there's been much more information over the last 24 hours about the situation in Chasiv Yar, and it seems that there are still Ukrainian troops holding out in the central area of Chasiv Yar, but it looks as if the pincers on these Ukrainian troops in central Chasiv Yar are closing. Syrskyi and Zelensky have deployed many forces, a large part of the Ukrainian army's reserves, to try to prevent that happening and to try to prevent the final fall of Chasiv Yar itself. But so far, this is having limited effect. And today, there have been suggestions that with the trap around the Ukrainian troops in central Chasiv Yar about to close completely, to shut completely, the Ukrainians are going to be forced to withdraw their troops from central Chasiv Yar over the course of the next perhaps 24 hours or perhaps 1 or 2 days, in which case the Russians will be in control of well over 90% of Chasiv Yar, and there will be only one outlying district, apparently, left to capture, and that district looks undefendable. The Battle of Chasiv Yar, in other words, will have ended. So it looks like we are observing an operational crisis here as well. Now, going further west, if you actually look at a map of Russian-controlled territory around Pokrovsk, Pokrovsk is already in a kind of semicircle, with the Russians positioned strongly to the south of Pokrovsk and to the west of Pokrovsk. The Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka highway has been conclusively cut, and the Russians are in a position, or so it seems to me, to conduct further advances from the west of Pokrovsk to cut off Pokrovsk's communications to the north, just as with the fall of Uspenivka, the Russians are apparently advancing west, immediately to the west of Pokrovsk. The village of Udachny is apparently now under heavy attack, and most observers expect it also to fall, in which case the battle for Pokrovsk itself will probably begin. It could be cut off from resupply fairly shortly. And my guess is that when we get to that point, when the main supply routes to Pokrovsk are indeed physically cut, then we will see a collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Pokrovsk as fast as the one we saw in Selidovo back in the autumn. All of this is pretty dramatic, but perhaps the most dramatic news of all is coming from the south. The Russians continue to advance in the south, in Zaporozhye region. General Teplinsky's forces appear to be clearing now the village of Kamenskaya. The Ukrainians are apparently short of men in this area as well. Their army has been depleted, and again, they have few reserves to try to plug holes. And of course, the Russians continue to advance westwards and northwards from Velikaya Novosilka, the two ultimate objectives being the town of Komar, which is apparently a major logistical center, and the village of Novopavlivka, which, if captured, apparently opens the way for an advance into Dnipro region and to Dnipro as well. And I've already said that, in my opinion, it is in the south, perhaps, that the Russians believe that the war will be won. This is where the main fight will happen, the key fight will happen. But we can see that the Russians are strong elsewhere as well. Now, there were two further pieces of information that really impressed me over the last, that I saw over the last couple of hours. Firstly, one hears much less than one did this time last year about Russian bombing of Ukrainian positions. This time last year, all the talk was about Russian airstrikes with precision-guided fab bombs. One rarely hears about this anymore, and one might even get the impression that the Russian air campaign against the Ukrainian ground forces has actually reduced. In fact, and I've done some research on this, it has not reduced, it has significantly increased. The Russians are conducting much heavier bombing of the Ukrainian army and have been doing so throughout this year than they were carrying out this time last year. So the Ukrainians are being very heavily bombed. The FAB bombs continue to fall in increasing levels of intensity. And moreover, isn't just the FAB bombs that fall, but they have indeed gradually become heavier. Today, a very high proportion of the bombs are FAB 1500s and FAB 3000s. The FAB 3000s were isolated examples when they were dropped at the start in the first half of last year. Now they've practically become standard. And all of this, even as the Russian Air Force continues to receive more advanced aircraft. There have been more deliveries of Sukhoi 35 fighter jets and of the enigmatic, all but invisible Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighter jet, which we know now is very active over the Ukrainian battlefields, but about which we hear virtually nothing. Anyway, the second thing is that so far as I can see, Russia has effectively achieved drone dominance behind Ukrainian battle lines. I've already commented about how there is a major difference between the Ukrainian use of drones, FPV drones and such drones, which has been mainly to attack Russian military units on the contact line, and Russian use of drones, which is focused on destroying Ukrainian supply vehicles on the supply roads. Now, right across the front lines, in every part of the front lines, it seems to me that the Russians have now achieved dense drone coverage of all of the supply roads, sending supplies to the Ukrainian forces. You see that in every one of the various theatres that I've talked about. And of course, here again, to repeat a point I have made many times, if an FPV drone, a single FPV drone, hits a tank, it is not going to do a huge amount of damage, provided the tank isn't hit in a specifically vulnerable position. These are armoured vehicles after all. Usually it would require multiple strikes by many FPV drones to knock out a tank or indeed any armoured vehicle. Whereas a single FPV drone, if it struck a lorry, especially a lorry carrying explosives or fuel, would destroy the lorry. So not only are the Russians focusing on destroying supply vehicles on the roads, but I suspect that these vehicles make much more logical targets for the Russian drones. The Ukrainian drone attacks look dramatic. You see tanks being struck by FPV drones. It's not always clear whether those drones have actually knocked out the tanks or done any significant damage to the tanks. And even when the tanks have been stopped, the Russian repair teams can repair them, and mostly do. But Ukraine has only a limited number of supply vehicles, and they are being destroyed continuously on the supply roads. And this is affecting the resupply of Ukrainian forces on the front lines. And lastly, Yuri Ignat, the representative of Ukraine's air defense system, is now once again saying that Ukraine has very limited ability to shoot down Kinzhal hypersonic missiles and Iskander ballistic missiles, such as the Russians are using with ever-increasing frequency. He said that the Patriot could initially successfully shoot down some of these missiles, but the Russians have adjusted and enhanced and improved these missiles to the level where the effectiveness of the Patriot against them is declining. The European supplied systems, the German and the Iris-Ts and all of those, the NASAMs apparently cannot counter these sort of weapons at all. And of course, he had absolutely nothing to say about the F-16s, which appear to be an irrelevance in this battle. So, not only are the Russians pushing forward west, but I get the sense that they're pushing forward against much weaker opposition this time than was the case last year. And with their tactics perfected and with their forces stronger and better trained and better equipped than last year as well. Of course, there's a further card that they may have ready to play sometime in the summer. The Russians will probably have built up a sufficient stockpile of Oreshnik missiles to begin to use them too. And well, what will the Ukrainians do then? Now, I understand that within the Pentagon, I obviously don't speak to people in the Pentagon, but I saw a media story which spoke about how people in the Pentagon talk about these Russian advances as a lava flow. Lava flows, of course, can look slow, though actually they're not, but they can look slow and incremental, but they're also irresistible, as anybody who's had the misfortune to have their house struck by a lava flow will confirm. And, well, there it is. That's apparently the one American military assessment. Now, where does all this leave the negotiations? I don't myself see why the Russians should feel pressure to negotiate in this situation. And if events on the battlefronts are shaping out the way I believe, then the pressure on Putin not to countenance negotiations would, I have thought, be very strong. Now, there are some American military officials that apparently still believe that in spite of all of this, Ukraine can still keep fighting and keep going, and that it has the means to defend itself successfully. General Cavoli, of course, spoke like that to Congress, that the Ukrainians are conducting a heroic and gallant resistance, and that this will be sufficient to keep holding things back. My own view, obviously, is completely different. I hope and assume that Trump, at least, is being kept informed of the actual true military realities. I saw an opinion poll which made it clear that the Republican Party's electoral base has now hardened in its hostility to more weapons, supplies and funding for Ukraine. The Ukrainians are apparently still balking at signing the mineral rights extraction agreement that Trump is apparently insisting that they sign. The American Commerce Secretary has spoken about the illogical behavior of the Ukrainians in refusing to sign the mineral rights extraction agreement. I tend to believe that this mineral rights extraction agreement was intentionally pitched by Donald Trump and the administration at a level that would make it impossible for Ukraine to sign it, thereby allowing the United States to walk away from what is now clearly a lost war. And perhaps, by the way, also to pursue some kind of rapprochement with the Russians. Time will show whether that does turn out to be so. Now, there's been a long article in the Daily Telegraph by Daniel Johnson, the Daily Telegraph's regular commentator, Daniel Johnson, on this whole issue. It speaks about Trump is counting on a quick Ukrainian peace deal, leaving Putin rubbing his hands. MAGA's calls for an imminent end to the war threaten to crush Kiev's brave resistance to Russia. And if you go through this very, very long article, you will eventually come to references to Trump possibly preparing to give Ukraine an ultimatum: sign the deal or else we will cut off your supplies, and perhaps an even further ultimatum to Ukraine: sign the deal. If you don't sign the deal, we will abandon you to the Russians. And that the deal must be, that the peace ultimately that you must agree to should be on Russian terms, Istanbul plus, and all of that. Now, this article of Daniel Johnson's has attracted a great deal of attention. Many people have commented on it. I have followed Daniel Johnson's work for quite a long time, by the way. He is a fairly well influential journalist in Britain. But I have to say, I don't think that he's writing this article with any inside knowledge. I don't believe that Daniel Johnson, from what I know about him, has many contacts within the British government, and certainly I don't believe he has any contacts within the American government. He is an ardent supporter of Ukraine. He's already in this article constructing a narrative of betrayal, which I suspect he believes himself, that Ukraine is in a position to continue its gallant battle of resistance against the Russian behemoth, but is about to be stabbed in the back by the sinister Donald Trump, who's out to make his deal with his wicked co-accomplice, Vladimir Putin. That's generally the way the article is written. And I think that all of the various claims made in it about, Trump ultimatums to Ukraine and all of that follow from that premise. I don't believe that there is going to be a Trump ultimatum to Ukraine as such. I simply think that Trump is probably under a great deal of advice to walk away, and that people who are behind the preparation of the mineral rights extraction deal framed it in such a way to make that possible. The thing that people like Daniel Johnson won't recognize is that whether Donald Trump walks away or not, the eventual outcome of the war is going to be a Russian military victory. The New York Times article that we've discussed so many times has shown the extent of America's involvement in the war in Ukraine. How the United States and the collective West did everything they realistically could do to defeat the Russians in Ukraine. Given that all that failed, there isn't really, realistically, anything more that can be done to prevent a Russian victory. The only choice is either to get the Ukrainians to agree to terms that will at least preserve Ukraine and achieve a negotiated peace, or if your primary interests are the United States, to walk away from the debacle. Anyway, there it is. This is my own personal view. I've set out what I think the military situation is in Ukraine. I've spoken about it in more detail than I have done in recent programs. Europe is in a muddle about everything. They're in a muddle about Ukraine. They have no coherent economic plans going forward. Their entire world is collapsing around them, and none of them seems to have a clue what to do. It is only a question of time, in my opinion, when the panic well and truly sets in on a scale far greater than we saw last year. And then we'll see what these very frightened people eventually do. It may not be at all pretty, just saying. But anyway, in terms of the situation in Europe, we've allowed the situation to bring us to the point when the Russians are about to launch an offensive. And I'm starting to think that this will indeed be the knockout move. Anyway, that's the end of my program today. You'll more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs in our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.